Welcome to SCI-Arc. Tonight, we're going to have the pleasure to talk to Frida Escobedo. She is the principal and founder of an architecture and design office based in Mexico City. The work of the office developed from art installations to furniture, design of residential, up to public buildings. So it's a wide spectrum of skills and projects that we'll see tonight. And I want to say something about the work, or at least as I see the work. I think it is well known that different designs invite different degrees of participation on the part of a person who chooses to consume it. I would say that a cool architecture incorporates increased involvement, but decreased description, while hot architecture is the opposite, decreasing involvement and increasing description. I think the work of Frida belongs to the first category, cool architecture. But at the same time, our production is careful in calibrating its effect towards any given event. The work feels temporary, if not in time, in its sensibility and consumption. Often, it is crafted to reflect the audience into themselves. So the design is simple in shape, but deep in the effect of its abstractions. Often, the form is obtained by removing something from the source, but it is always obtained by the accumulation of material parts, or if you want, the brick, the tile, the module. The projects seem to secretly address time as a social operation. They reactivate urban spaces that are considered to be residual or forgotten. The work is placed marginally by design and theoretical intentions, but they're not marginal. They're actually at the center. And this is what I think makes the work unexpected and eventful, and at times, even radical. In addition to her practice, Frida has taught at Columbia and Harvard. She is the recipient of the 2017 Architectural League Emergent Voice Award, and in 2018, was selected to design the 18th Serpentine Summer Pavilion in London, which I think is a great honor for any architect, and she is the youngest to receive this honor. So please join me in welcoming Frida Escobedo to our SCI-Arc virtual stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, for the amazing introduction. And thank you, Hernan, for the invitation to join you tonight, and Yasil for making this possible. I'm going to share my screen with you. I would just want to ask confirmation if you're seeing my full screen. Are you able to see it now?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you so much. Well, as Elena was mentioning, I have a studio in Mexico City dedicated to architecture, design, and arts. And even though I work across these disciplines, I still call myself an architect. And perhaps it was when I was enrolling in architecture school that I was unconsciously pursuing a career that would give me more a structure of thought rather than a definition of a profession. So I think that idea just became stronger when I did my master's in art design in the public domain, a program that appeared in 2010 at the GSD, Harvard GSD. And then it really became clear to me that maybe spaces should be thought about in a more broad spectrum, and to work in different scales did not necessarily mean to stop thinking about the architectural practice in itself. So at the beginning of my time at the GSD, I went to a lecture by Robert Irwin, who had come in early November to the school to give a lecture. And listening how his practice had shifted and changed so much over the years, guided primarily by the drive to continuously open up paths of inquiry rather than trying to find answers, was quite liberating to me. I remember that evening, I was lucky enough to be invited along with some other students to join Robert to a dinner. And he was very kind and funny. He was very patient, and he seemed to enjoy the company of younger students. And I think that the lesson that struck the most to me and that became the most valuable even like besides the lecture, was the idea that we are not aware that we are trapped in our knowledge. So it's crucial to understand that at some point we need to disregard everything we have learned, and instead we just need to see. A year later, while I was doing my master's degree, there you go. I received this beautiful piece of petrified wood from Arizona as a gift. At that time, I was doing some research on how modernist facades, in their apparent neutrality, are capable of expressing social behaviors and values, even when there's not a trace of symbolic component in sight. And this piece of petrified wood really embodied very accurately what I was trying to express in terms of the relationship between the social practice and the architectural form. Patterns formed or found in materials such as this petrified piece of wood, or the wood itself, like this one, actually have a presence or a way of registering time in a very particular way. To me, the architectural object develops in a similar fashion, via accretion and erosion, varying habitation, appropriation, exchange, and agency. And the same way that these traces of the tree register climatic changes or specific moments, the architecture registers the use and appropriation of time. So in that sense, if forms follows function, it was crucial to me to understand that function was never static, definite, or predictable. Form was an index of its own genesis, and therefore architecture can always be an open question, an inquiry into what is, what might be, and how the latter would happen. So if architecture is both the crystallization of a specific historic and social moment and the reflection on the imaginary status of the future object. These ideas had been sitting in the back of my head, and that gift just really articulated a new way of thinking about them. So reflecting back on that time, it was a moment where I thought also that architecture might just be a language to me, and just like any other, a way to understand the world and to situate myself in it. And I realized that certain situations or objects actually work not just as descriptions that could be read or interpreted, but also as mirrors. In the end, it is only through the filter of personal experience that one is capable of reading specific things in objects, people, or places. So a few months later, I found this book by Roger Calois called The Writing of Stones. It was published for the first time in France in 1970, and it summarizes most of the interests that Calois developed throughout his life. In 1934, Calois broke from the Surrealist group, and it is said that it was over a very particular argument he had with André Breton over jumping beans, Mexican jumping beans. These seeds spontaneously jump without any apparent reason. And Breton was really curious to understand how this could happen. And he was really curious to understand that process. And he suggested that they should dissect the bean to research for this magical property. So Breton completely disagreed to this idea and called Calois a second-class positivist that was killing the magical thinking by doing this kind of research or searching for explanations. And Calois, in turn, accused Breton of worshipping the irrational and indulging in these literary pirouettes that he was famous for. So the breakup between Calois and Breton happened shortly after, and Calois continued to develop this curiosity in numerous texts combining investigation and poetry. Massimiliano Gioni, in the introduction of the book, points out Calois' highly personal vision of the natural allowed him to imagine a form of interdisciplinarity that was the invisible subterranean relationships that had to be unearthed in order to allow the manifestation of a new and more complex imagination of the universe. And what I find interesting in Calois' vision is that it opens up the possibility to find a common axis between seemingly dissimilar phenomena. These mineral formations are not static, but fluid and unstable if we see them for longer periods of time than we used to. These fusions, exterior forces, accidents, and imprints of matter on matter have traces that, as Marguerite Yourcenar points out in a different introduction of the book, almost exactly resemble writings in which actually they do transcribe events from millions of years ago. So for me, Calois was looking for a contradiction that also appears in architecture's very own nature. It is simultaneously a very precise snapshot of a particular historical moment, and at the same time, it is in continuous flux and transformation. Probably the most interesting revelation that Calois gave to us is that through aesthetics, we can find history. So around the time that I was looking at this book, I was also working on my thesis project under the guidance of two of the most influential teachers that I've had, Erika Naginski and Krzysztof Wodiszko. And the project focused specifically on a building that is located very close to where I live here in Colonia Juárez, and also very close to where I grew up in Mexico City. This building is one of the many modernist office buildings in downtown Mexico City, and it seems really not to have anything in particular, but I always felt attracted and it always appealed to me. I think it kind of evokes the same excitement that I find in ruins, but it was not a ruin in itself. It had a different condition. I think as opposed to the process of erosion that a ruin may undergo, this building kind of creates a different thing. It starts accumulating the signs of time in an accretion form. Its materiality makes it very hard to define where the facade starts and ends, and where it's almost like a shoreline that grows and recedes slowly over time. So although also the glass facade seems to be practically untouched, it is a series of additions that happen behind that create this kind of stratification of construction and decay. And it is precisely because the building facade has remained intact and concurrently changing that I'm drawn to this building. I find it very interesting to analyze, even if it's like a very ordinary building, and actually there's no register of the architect who built it. I think it was actually built by an engineer. So behind the glass facade, one can really read the half-hidden narrative that inhabits the space through these materials customizations. Every curtain, drywall, tape, or ad that is added to the window compounds the facade's split nature or split subject, one divided across identity and representation. So if we consider that architecture is a discipline that thinks a relationship between society as form, as Sanford Quinter once pointed out, then we should think that the architectural status as a domain of cultural representation really resides in the capacity to act as a mnemonic tool for both the historical and the social calibrations of time. The first one supposes the conscious interruption of a continuity in the social reality and has the quality for being deliberately manifested in particular spatial forms that we're very familiar with, like monuments, plazas, memorials, institutions, what Lefebvre calls representation of space. Nevertheless, facades appear to be increasingly less interested in materializing, manifesting, or registering social time. So having lost the structural function first, and then the symbolic narrative power, the facade now is to have been losing the ability to act as a signifier of what happens inside, or what could be considered the more intimate realm. And that's where these overlaps of aspirations and reality start to happen, such as a French window or an adobe window behind a modernist facade. So in common thought, modernism was largely held accountable for this act of erasure. Typically, the modernist architectural object was staged as a scene for the object's standardized production, aiming toward neutrality. As Juliana Bruno points out in one of her texts, if the facade is the face, then the problem of modernism is the skin. modernist architecture was, after all, an architecture of the surface. So how is it that this rigid modernist structure could provide conditions for agency and expressions? And I think curtain walls carry within themselves two opposing possibilities: a gaze from the outside and a gaze from the inside. This piece called Public Space to Audiences by Donald Judd brilliantly illustrates it. These surfaces are kind of open to exchange, and they simultaneously accept the inscription, but also uphold the wall. These qualities signals that the fact the architecture is an object that ultimately is not coincidental with itself, but rather, as Merleau-Ponty puts it, it is perpetually changing, becoming something other than it appears to be. And in its permanent process, it continues to carry traces of its original aspirations, along with the marks of its failure. So what the building in Colonia Juárez reminded me of is that facades materialize the character, whether intended for that purpose or not, and perform their function the way that masks perform the social face. In the case of Mexican character, Octavio Paz, one of our most prominent poets, pointed out that we perform it simultaneously on one hand as a shield, a wall, and on the other hand as a symbol covered surface or a hieroglyph. So the facade has an etymological origin on facha that points out its instrumentality as a public face of the building, while at the same time it shares an etymological root with facere, to do, to make, and that kind of relationship suggests that the mechanism of the construction of an identity is simultaneously a projection and an appropriation. So the facade arguably works as a collective mirror stage, a representation of the relationships of individuals to the real conditions of collective existence. It works to me simultaneously as a face and a mask. And we can only agree with Deleuze and Guattari when they point out that the mask does not hide the face. It is the face. In Mexico, you can see that modernism was a notion that was tied to progress and development, but it really became a rehearsal of a future that never arrived. But I think it is precisely because of this failure, of its incompleteness and lack, that modernism allowed for a recapitulation of the Mexican character. We can constantly ponder how this could be tied to a cultural critique of modernity, an issue that was profoundly provocative because it appeared precisely at the moment when Mexico was living the dream or illusion of progress, especially in the early 50s, where Mexico had committed to attaining a future that was, by definition, unreachable. Modernity had established a notion of future that was synonymous with progress, and this entailed a division of the world into parts: the modern and the ancient, the latter composed of all these cultures that did not share the same principles, ideas, systems of organizations, or even institutions. So in this time when universal types ruled, it was important to pose a question whether personal and collective identity were central issues that need to be addressed. And at that time, and possibly still, to further define our own sense of existence and identity, it is necessary to recognize what we consider to be the other. So as Octavio Paz pointed out, the history of Mexico has been a long struggle to negate, conceal, and unmask otherness. His reading of otherness holds two meanings. The first corresponds to the country's social reality, dividing it into two parts, one developed and the other underdeveloped. The second reading eludes the notion of poverty and wealth, development of backwardness, and simply acts as a complex of unconscious attitudes and structures. These notions refers to ideology and a social psyche, and how historically there are certain behaviors in Mexican character that prevent us from manifesting ourselves. So it's almost like building layer after layer to create this new persona. This notion refers also to the mask and how we attempt to hide this otherness, which is an everyday practice in our personal, intimate self, and it does so in a way of stratification. And we see that from pre-colonial times to colonial stratification in this building on the corner of the Museo de la Ciudad de México. So in a race towards development, otherness became the ballast that stood between us and progress, and we conveniently decided to sweep it under a carpet of hegemonic historical discourse, flattening it into a single official national identity that was accompanied by the search of an international style that was proliferating all over the city. This kind of development had produced an oxymoronic effect on what the word means. Instead of unfolding and opening out, it created inwardness as an illusionary form of liberation. So this building is an example of this type of ubiquitous but anonymous modernist building. In it, we can see how, in contradicting fashion, it is under the impression of being concealed by this thin apparent neutrality of the facade that this building allowed itself to become an index, as I was saying, of its own genesis. It seems to defy the notion that Juliana Bruno was positing, that in some way the modernist architecture does not absorb the passing of time. This is a building that is built with time. Like the rings on a tree, like in this piece by Giuseppe Pegnone, this building bears the marks of duration, life, and weathering. And these marks also reveal how the other Mexico, the submerged and the repressed, reappears in the modern Mexico. This underlying stratum of the social psyche, the intangible reality formed by the beliefs, fragments of beliefs, and the concept that the history of that Paz explored in his writing become manifest under this transparent mask. It is kind of a subsoil that is not the sediment from a dead past, but also like a vital and active constituent part of our present reality. This visual unfolding that happens in the surface of this building is similar to the simple beauty of some of the natural geomorphic materials, such as marble or these sedimentary rocks that register the change and growth and provide their richness and value in that kind of history. I think this is an intelligent facade, and these facades manifest as a spontaneous accretions, subtractions, and reorganize itself to the continuous flow of the temporary rhythms of everyday life. So it's really adapting to the needs of its users. So for this project, and at least for that part, initial part in 2012, I started to do these drawings to recognize the curtain wall of the facade as a liminal zone of exchange. And this transparent surface was paralleling the thresholds between the face and the mask, between oneness and otherness. And for this production, we also started like doing photographs of each one of the layers of the building. And then the images were decoded in a stratigraphic approach. So every single window was photographed, understanding all of its layers and isolating them as each one of the elements to allow to recognize the hidden codes that compose the facade. Some of them had a better relationship with transparency. Some of the others really negated that kind of translucency that happened with the street. So removed from the context of origin, these displaced and stripped down fragments really did not aim to restore the authentic story of the building, but wanted to create or generate a projected narrative. This series of accretions, as I was saying, express more to me the social life, the need for space, shadow, storage, isolation from the weather, humidity control, to name a few. And some of them reveal the different levels of awareness that the inhabitants had of the street and the facade, or the lack of. Others reveal even religious preferences, political affiliations, and even desires and aspirations. So this project has been or was definitely a departure from my previous work as an architect. But while I was doing my master's degree, it became like this a moment where I realized that analyzing spaces could actually provide a lot of information for the projects that I was developing. And so this has been a project that has been ongoing for almost 8 years now, and it has several iterations. I'm going to present a different iteration in a bit. But it's interesting to see that while I was doing this research for my thesis project, I was also working in this very pragmatic work of a public building called La Tallera in Cuernavaca, Morelos. So I think to me, this was without a doubt a challenge, and sometimes a struggle, to be honest, because it was like having one foot on the academic and like the abstract way of thinking, and then having one foot on the practical, trying to do something with very little resources in Mexico. So La Tallera Siqueiros is a public building located in Cuernavaca. It used to be the home and workshop for David Alfaro Siqueiros. And when he passed away, he decided to leave his state to the city of Cuernavaca to create a cultural institution. And in 2010, this was the condition that it had. It was quite brought down. It was still active, but with very little activities within it. And there was a competition to renovate it and to add a few layers to the program, such as an archive, a bookstore, a cafeteria, and then to reactivate the program of the museum with some workshops and a studio. And as you can see, the condition of the building is that it is facing a plaza. And the courtyard that is facing the plaza actually worked as an extension of the workshop to paint these murals. David Alfaro Siqueiros was a self-proclaimed socialist, and he believed that art should be public and accessible to everyone. So he was focusing a lot on these murals that were presented on public spaces. And this was the space that served to him to paint. So some of the murals were facing the facade, and some of the others were actually within the courtyard. And to me, when I was visiting the site for the first time, I was surprised by two things. One was the immense structure that had to hold these murals. And the second one was that they were trapped behind this barrier to the street. So actually this is a photograph from the other side of the street. This is from a garage entrance. And I think this guy was the most privileged one because he was looking at an art piece every time he took his car out. And I was wondering at that time how we could build a strategy where we could rotate the murals and bring them back to their position of being public art. So that was kind of the strategy for the competition, to really open this facade that was facing the courtyard, and then using the massive structure to house the new programs. The structure, as you can see, was in really poor condition. So it was necessary to substitute it anyway. So I thought that having so little resources, perhaps we could do something for the program, and it could be housed behind the murals, almost like a backstage. And we went from a condition where this was an enclosed courtyard and there was a very small entrance, almost like a service entrance. And we opened the gates, so to speak, by rotating the murals and unfolding the space like this Ligia Pape piece is presenting, like just one slight shift in one of the sheets of metal actually affects the whole piece. So that was the idea, moving from one single rotation of a mural and a very tiny entrance into something that could open up, create a forced perspective, and then guide the visitor not only to the museum, but also to frame a plaza that could have new uses. So this is the murals when they were rotated and they're connected to the plaza. As you can see now, the plaza is actually activated by the murals, and there's an extension of the building also because it's appropriating the plaza. And it's not just giving the courtyard to the public space, it's not losing it, it's actually gaining a bigger public space that is a plaza. And the second strategy was to try to create an envelope that would wrap all these series of buildings that were constructed over time. He initially started building his workshop, and then he started making additions. A dark room for photography, storage spaces, and so on. So the strategy was to use cinder block for the new spaces, and then to cover the whole building in a cinder block celosía, this lattice that would allow some transparency, but also a very specific identity that could create like more monolithic view of the building. This kind of transparency would allow some of the uses within the space to start showing, and also it will allow for the light and the sun to come in, and also the wind. Cuernavaca is a city famously known for its weather, so we took advantage of that, and then you can open the windows and really use the light and space and air for both exhibition space and the workshops. So this is a renovated workshop, and some of the other spaces that connect the workshops with the archive and the store. And the strategy was also to have very honest materials. We were thinking that not only we should use apparent materials because of the practicality and the savings that we could have at the moment of construction, but also as a way to have something that would age nicely and that would need very little maintenance in the future. So it's a way to guarantee that the aesthetic of the space would only get better with the weathering and with time, and not to depend on huge budgets to maintain it perfectly. And another strategy that was done to this courtyard was to use the difference of levels between the street and the main entrance to create this kind of sunken courtyards for the cafeteria and also for the bookshop. So there's a separation between the programs, but actually it also connects to the plaza. So as I was saying, like the front stage is the plaza and the murals, and it's accompanied by these other uses, but it's not in the same way that many of the museums today articulate the spaces, that you enter through the gift shop. In this case, you enter to the plaza, you enter to the space, and if you want to, you can go into the sunken courtyards to have these other amenities with a museum. This is a courtyard for the cafeteria. And that kind of relationship creates a very nice space and a very intimate space for the bookshop, for book presentations, but also for performances or like children's storytelling circles. And on the upper floors, this is the archive that is also looking outside, but has like this simple, almost like triangular shape to it that is given by the mural's position. And in the night, you can see that it works as a lantern, so you can really understand the transparency of the spaces and the program that is happening behind them. A while ago in the interview, we were talking about this idea of doing public buildings and what the difference with a private commission. And I think one of the most interesting moments of designing a public building is when people start appropriating it. And that kind of happens in Mexico City when people start recognizing a building as something that they like. They start taking the quinceañera photos or the wedding pictures in this kind of spaces. So in one of my visits, I was lucky enough to catch this couple that was having their wedding photographs in this space. And I thought it was really wonderful, because that meant that this was a significant building that they were willing to take back home and to have that photograph of that space in their private space. And I was even happier to find out that it was used as a background for a banda music video. So I think, in my opinion, this was a very successful and well-received project for both publics. And around that time, I was also doing this pavilion in Mexico City. It was 2010. It's a competition that was proposed in the Eleco Museum. Eleco Museum was designed in 1953 by sculptor Matthias Geritz, a Mexican artist of German origin who worked closely with Luis Barragan. And it was conceived as inhabitable sculpture. So the competition was quite difficult because the project has a very particular geometry. A courtyard that is occupied by two elements originally, one a yellow stele and then the black serpent that later disappeared or was removed from the museum. And it was really difficult to try to propose a pavilion that would have a conversation with this space. And while thinking about the proposal, I came across an interview of Mexican writer Brenda Lozano. And she mentioned in the interview that her work as a writer was very similar to the work of a bricklayer, just putting one word next to the other until you would build a text. And I thought, like, well, maybe if her work is similar to the work of a bricklayer, then maybe I can think that I can draw a parallel between architecture and concrete poetry. And following Ferreira Goulart's principles, the concrete poem or ideogram becomes a relational field of functions, and one can try to find the maximum expression through a minimum of words. And to me, the single word became the cinder block. Growing up in Mexico City, I had seen how this very simple, modular, industrially produced material gives way to a multitude of expressions, from balconies to staircases to screens to everything in between. And it was just like this idea of repeating a single gesture that can actually make visible a lot of differences. Very similar to this Agnes Martin drawing, where the perfect grid reveals the nuances of the moment when it is drawn, like where the pencil starts getting blunt, or the texture of the paper, or the trace of the hand as it shakes when it's getting tired. So the proposal was very simple. It was to lay the bricks in a regular pattern with several layers of block. And actually, we could create specific scenarios to be configured for the program of the museum, such as this seating arrangement, like a forum. But we could also do a gathering space, a bar, a labyrinth, and so on. And people were encouraged to move around the pieces in their own desire, those changing the syntaxis of the space, very much like when you shift letters of the words and then you create a new meaning. And as you can see here, there are like these two girls playing in the space, moving pieces around, creating their own landscape, and building really their own world. So it was a moment where the programmed layer and the spontaneous layer are coexisting together in the same space, and it's possible to see them together. Another interventions were done specifically by other artists, such as Pia Camila and her group El Resplandor, for a specific performance. And then lectures and a series of night events happen in the pavilion. And another part of the proposal that was really important was that it disappeared without leaving any trace. So people were encouraged to take the blocks with them. They could take one to finish a bookshelf, and they could take 100 if they wanted to do a little room. And of course, at the end of the day, it was a developer who took all of them to build an apartment complex in Mexico City. But in the end, it returned to the city and it left no trace. So I think that was the main purpose, and we were happy that they were gone. And these series of small interventions actually have given me a lot of experimentation room. And the following opportunity that I had to rethink this relationship between the visible and the invisible was an invitation that I had in 2013 by Jose Esparza, who was commissioned with the public's program for the Lisbon Triennial. And the invitation was to do a public podium for his program. And the stage had to fulfill all of these concepts, but most importantly, it had to put into question the relationship between speaker and audience. And as you know, typically a stage provides an unilateral direction where the speaker is standing in a podium and looking at the audience, or like now, not even like seeing the audience. And it's like a one-way street. But I believe that the voice of the speaker is not is only as loud as the number of people who reaches. So I propose a circular 15-meter diameter stage that had a little element to it that was like a faceted bottom that would allow for it to work as a seesaw, almost literally raising the voice of the speaker as people gathered to listen. And this also provided, of course, like more playful conditions and speculations. The next thing that was a challenge was to find a position for the stage, and Lisbon is filled with beautiful plazas, so selecting one of where the stage would be was a difficult task. Many of these plazas have a symmetry treat, and they're adjacent to either a public or religious building. So we were analyzing all of these plazas, and we were looking at Plaza Rocio, one of the main plazas in the city. And then we eventually came to Plaza de Figueira, which is right next to Rocio. And this was a plaza that was really different from the rest. It was a former market that was turned into a transportation hub with an underground parking space. And as you can see, the equestrian statue of King John I was not placed in the center of the square. It's aligned to the street, so it's given a view from the street, but it's actually not recognizing the plaza itself. And people in Lisbon describe it more like a transit space rather than a gathering space. So we thought it was perfect to locate the civic stage there, because then it could re-articulate the relationship with this space. So this is the stage as it was positioned in place, and all of the production happened in Mexico City. The fabrication was done here, and then it was shipped to Lisbon, which was also an interesting condition because it allowed me to see the difference of the economies and how manufacture really is a completely different thing in both cities. And a different thing that also needed to happen, aside from all the series of events that you can see here, from the opening to some of the other events, such as this play by Andrés Jaque, Superpowers of 10, which required an additional addition to the podium because it needed to perform as a theater space, but we wanted to create something that would also question the idea of performance. So we proposed a circular curtain that would be attached to the platform, and the idea was to invert the condition of the stage. So the platform would be actually the seating space, and the city therefore would become the backdrop, and the audience would be able to experience it in a different way just by reframing some views. So on the evening of the premiere, this is all the architects gathered in the podium, and then something really special happened because we were one layer of audience, and then as the stage open, there was this double layer of people coming out of the balconies and then just experiencing the full play, thus creating like a more complex relationship between inside and out, and what performance space is, and who is the spectator and who is the performer. So this series of experiments that have like this boundary between pavilion and installation always had like a performative aspect to it, but rarely it was analyzing space in a different perspective. And I think it was until I designed Estación 16 for the biennial, the architecture biennial in Orleans in 2018, that I was able to really experiment with something that was closer to sculpture, but was also talking about space, history, urbanism, and many other spatial practices. This is a still from the movie Los Olvidados by Luis Buñuel, and in it he impeccably portrays the post-revolutionary Mexico. At that time in Mexico, we were a country in the making, and we had to come up with an identity that was not clearly defined at that point. The conflict was that on one hand, we wanted to project an image of development and sophistication, while simultaneously showing a Mexico that had to overcome a social injustice and the hegemony that the landholders and foreigners had over the country's economy for centuries. So it was under this context that modernity was reinterpreted to reconcile progress and tradition and to work as an effective tool for the country's transformation. But we need to consider that there was a very important political factor into this equation. The revolutionary movement of 1910 was composed of many different fractions, actually, and had many different political agendas. So the triumph of the revolution in 1917 actually didn't guarantee a peaceful transition into democracy. Quite the opposite. There was a period that followed the revolution that consisted of a series of really anarchic revolts that most of the times culminated in the death of the elected candidate in turn. And this form of systematic elimination of the head of state and the presidential candidates led to a regime that was neither democratic nor self-destructive. And in order to guarantee their own survival, the group in power established two measures that broke the cycle of violence and death. One was non-re-election, and the second one was the creation of Partido Revolucionario Nacional, which later became Partido Revolucionario Institucional, or PRI, which we all know, or many of we know. So for the next 72 years, the figure of the president and the party became indivisible. The party was dedicated to preserve the political control, not necessarily through physical repression, but by deploying very subtle mechanisms of manipulation. And while the party remained loyal to the president in turn, it was known that it was only going to be for a specific period of time, of 6 years, basically. And at the end of the day, the control laid in the hands of the party and not in the president. So in other words, it was PRI's mission to guarantee the stability that was necessary for progress to flourish, and therefore to establish the general vision of the nation. There's this beautiful piece by Tercero Un Quinto, a collective of artists also based in Mexico City, that describes this type of condition where they're analyzing how this political propaganda is painted throughout towns and cities in Mexico with a very thin layer of paint that actually creates a transparency. And you can see how this accretion or layering of names is actually just a continuation of the same thing. So it's almost like this pyramid image that I was presenting early in this lecture, where one is disguising the other, but it's actually the accumulation that is giving the strength and the personality to the political party. And for this moment where all these institutions and the general vision of the nation needed to happen, there was one key political figure that was Pedro Ramírez Vázquez. He is one of the most famous Mexican artists, and he defined himself as an architect who had an undefined style, which was very convenient for the party's interests. In my opinion, his work was not about style, but more about strategy, even like military strategy. Nevertheless, in this period of time when everything was being created, things were not as happy as they seemed. By the time Gustavo Díaz Ordaz came to power, the vision of modernity and progress endorsed by the state, was tarnished by political unrests and a political crisis that was really impossible to deny. And the tension produced by the sharp social contrast culminated on October the 2nd, 1968, in the infamous Tlatelolco massacre, where thousands of students died and many others disappeared. The question is that the Olympic Games were inaugurated only a week after this dreadful event without any interruptions in the public program. Pedro Ramirez Vázquez actually was designated as the general director of the Olympic Games, and this position has never been given to any other architect before or after Pedro Ramirez Vázquez. So this gives an example of his vision for the state, not only for public buildings, but also for the image that we wanted to project into other countries. And Pedro Ramirez Vázquez had this vision of recovering the original spirits of the Olympic Games, which celebrated the human spirit in all of its dimension, both physical and spiritual. And for that purpose, he organized the Cultural Olympics, a series of events that would happen in parallel to the Games. And one of the key components to that program was Ruta de la Amistad, a public sculpture project that was installed along the newly inaugurated Periférico. But the controversy behind Ruta de la Amistad was the conflict behind abstraction and figuration. This is a map of all the stations, and each one of the invited countries was invited to present a sculpture to create this route. And this problem between abstraction and figuration was that, on one hand, in the following years after the revolution, the muralist movement had successfully transmitted many of the social and political messages for reunification. In contrast, after the Cold War, non-figurative language became the preference for the representation of PRI. So there was no conflict of presenting any symbolic meaning on these commissioned sculptures. So the colorful and monumental sculptures conveniently portrayed us almost as a cosmopolitan and modern nation without having to appeal to either an explicit nationalism or a provincial aesthetic. We have these images of an empty periférico, which is an unusual view. As you can hear, there's a lot of traffic in Mexico, even in the pandemic. And while I was doing the research with this photographic survey of the sculptures, I found this series of photographs that were taken at the moment of the construction of the Ruta. And when I was growing in Mexico City, I always thought that these sculptures were like these monumental, solid concrete sculptures, but it actually became apparent that they were just like these very fragile structures. To my surprise, they revealed almost in the same way the contradictory nature of the cultural project of that area as well. There are these images where the scaffolds and the structure of the sculpture became almost indistinguishable, revealing the apparent monumentality depends actually on the precarious. And it almost resembles this Svetlana Boym's description of the monument to the Third International, where she mentions that this monument is materialized by many of the implicit and explicit meanings of the word revolution, which literally means rotation and repetition. So let's remember that it was until the 17th century when the word was associated with the opposite meaning, that is of a rupture, of a break, or an unrepeatable event. This project actually represents the sculpture as a skeleton, as a provocation of a reappropriation and the repurpose of a sculpture, but it also materializes the conflicts and contradictions of this historical moment, in which the mask of apparent progress and harmony actually was concealing a lot of fragility and social turmoil. So for the Orleans Biennial, of course, it made sense to select Estación 16 designed by French sculptor Olivier Segan. We couldn't find the precise plans in Pedro Ramirez Vázquez archives, so we had to do this kind of archaeological research and reconstruction from photographs. This is Olivier Segan in front of his sculpture. And we worked with an amazing team of metal workers to kind of decipher all the elements and the pieces. We found that many of the elements of the structure were actually scraps from other buildings that were being constructed at the time. And we were able to recreate the structure and have it presented first at the Frac Center in Orleans, and then at the Source Botanical Garden, where it has its permanent home now. The funny story is that we were trying to look for Olivier Segan for a long time to see if he had some archival photos or plans, and we couldn't find him. We knew that he was living in Mexico for a long time, and then he moved back to France. And very serendipitously, one of the people working at the Frac Center mentioned that someone had said that Olivier Segan was actually living in Orleans. So we were able to contact him. The sculpture came back to him, and he seemed really happy about it. And actually, he created a relationship with the Frac Center, and now many of his archival photos are in that institution. So this kind of experiment of sculpture and space, I think, really culminated in this more recent project, the Serpentine Pavilion, which was an invitation I received in 2018. And honestly, I almost missed the invitation, because I received on my email a mail that said invitation Serpentine Pavilion, and I thought it was more like a mailing list, or to join some sort of supporters or sponsors group, and never imagined that I would be invited to design this pavilion. So we lost a week, and after the initial freak out, we were trying to see what the strategy would be for the pavilion. And of course, there have been so many amazing iterations of this project that it was really hard to try to come up with an idea that had not been built or proposed in the past. And as we're looking at the program, trying to find something that we could grab on and just propose a fresh idea, we came up also in the program with this note that said that the pavilion is sold every year to either a private institution or a private collector. And that moment was, again, like this moment of a shift in thought, where I was considering, like, well, maybe this pavilion can teach us a lesson that changes the way that I learned architecture, at least. I was taught that architecture should be very site-specific, and also that it should be permanent. So this kind of program really broke with that idea, because a pavilion was to be located very specifically in front of the Serpentine Gallery, but then it would move somewhere else that we wouldn't know until it was bought. So it had to work for any sort of context. And on the other hand, it was going to be temporary for the Kensington Gardens, and then it would turn to be a permanent piece in its new and unknown home. This, of course, reminded me of how abstract this idea of time and space is, and how actually humans have deployed so many different strategies to try to grasp the idea of time and space. Many of them, like the Jeffersonian grid, that ignores even like geological or social boundaries, or the meridians and the parallels that actually create a different dynamic in the world, and almost like define the way that the world is articulated, and how the commerce is deployed, and even like the time structure, and how we are always behind Europe, for example, in terms of time. And thinking about these ways of measuring time and space, it was important to know that the ground zero for this type of thinking, especially in terms of the meridians and the parallels, was the Greenwich meridian, which is only a few miles away from the Serpentine Pavilion. So this line really creates that division where that's a 0 point, and everything is just like measured from there. And it's also like a good reminder of how recent all of these concepts are. There is this clock that has 24 hours instead of 12, and seeing it and seeing how disorienting that is makes us realize that maybe the way that we're measuring time and space has to do more with an economic construct rather than a social or a personal perception of time. So that was the main goal, to have a pavilion that would reconnect you with your social context and also with your own understanding of the time as it passes during the day. So the meridian line really informed the geometry of the space. We also were interested in presenting something that we were familiar with, and the way that we were designing spaces here in the office in Mexico City. So we decided to do an enclosed courtyard that would provide this kind of safe and intimate space for people to gather. And also that would challenge this idea of inside and outside again, because you're inside the garden, which is an outside of the city, but it's also inside the city. So I created this kind of Russian doll effect of interiority and exteriority. And then the roof that is placed on top of the courtyard actually is aligned to the true north, thus giving you an orientation. So it functions almost as a compass and as a way to navigate the space, not only locally, but also like in the larger cosmos. And of course, we had to select a material, and we decided to go again for a very simple, easy to find material. We went for concrete roof tiles, a material that was easily available, that would create this kind of curvature, that would give a lot of texture to the walls. And then we kind of wove these roof tiles into an intricate pattern that would create more transparency or more opacity depending on how you would see it. We were, of course, not allowed to say that we were designing the pavilion, and we were contacting a few fabricators, and they really didn't understand why a Mexican studio wanted to have roof tiles that had holes in them. They were trying to convince us that we would get water inside whatever we were designing, and we reassured them that we were not going to use them for a roof because they were worried the liability issue. And when we mentioned that we were building a wall with them, they were just like, you guys don't understand what you're doing. And then the fabricator, of course, found out like what we were doing, and he agreed to do this perforated roof tiles. And this is what we were able to achieve. Actually, this is a modular system, so it's like a prefabricated modules of roof tiles and rebar, and then it's easily constructed on site, and very easy also to deconstruct, store, and then build again in this new location. And as I was saying, like these weaving pattern allows for opacity, to total opacity on a diagonal view, and then transparency if you see it up front. And then this roof that is aligned to the true north creates this invisible threshold between inside and outside, and creates like this negative effect with the ceiling and the shallow pool. So there's this reflection play that also kind of situates yourself in the space and allows you to see the movement of the sun. This is a very nice moment where these two kids are standing in the swimming and the shallow pool exactly at the summer solstice, where the sun is aligning perfectly with the water line. And of course, the reflection that creates these distorted effects. So you really don't understand at first glance the geometry of the space. You never read it as a box when you're inside. It's a more diffuse effect that creates this effect of like wanting to wander throughout each one of the sections of the pavilion. And of course, the idea behind the Meridian line was accompanied by an amazing program by the Serpentine Galleries team. We had very interesting interventions by Ghetto Gastro, talking about colonialism and territory and food, and some other performances that happened. And we're also talking about geography and space. And when we were asked by the crew of reporters and photographers what would be the money shot for the pavilion, because they're used to having like a specific view for the pavilion, they were having these, and it was quite boring for them. And we were always trying to convince them that there was no precise view for the pavilion. It was more about the experience of the space. So for Personal Archive, we've been taking advantage of the web and all these moments that people have been posting on Instagram and their social media, actually reflecting how they see the pavilion and how they were experiencing the space and being reflected in the space. And this is my favorite post where it says like they really like the pavilion, but it's bloody difficult to photograph. And I think it makes it really successful because it means that then it's not an architectural object that is seen as something that you can see from outside, but something that you need to experience within. And my favorite picture of all is this picture of the team of the Stage 1, the wonderful construction team that builds all the pavilions each year. And they had this moment where they just finished on time for the opening, and they were taking a rest, and they decided to just lay down on the floor and see each other. And of course, I joined the photograph a few seconds later, and we all took a group photograph reflected on the ceiling. So we were present on the space. And just going back to the first project, and this is something that happened recently, and that's the project that I want to close the lecture with. The last iteration of Split Subject, a project that started, as I was saying, 8 years ago. We were invited by Troy Conrad and Manuel Sirauki to participate in an exhibition called Architecture Effects in Bilbao, the Guggenheim Museum. And they wanted to present like what contemporary architects were thinking about space post-digital era. And around that time, a friend of mine called me and said, like, remember that building that you were analyzing a few years ago for your thesis dissertation? Well, that building is actually on rent or on sale, if you call them. And I thought it was a perfect moment to try to get a hold of the windows. So we did a negotiation with the owner, and we were able to actually acquire some of them. This is the first time that I was able to enter the space. It was empty now, but it still held the marks of time and use and habitation that I was analyzing from the start. So you can see that some of the furniture left its traces before someone had put like a opaque membrane to allow the sun to stay out. And to my surprise, there was an aviation school within that building. There was like these demonstration or like a simulation chamber inside the building. So full of surprises, and we were able to take some of these windows with us and analyze them and photograph them and preserve them. This is the way that they were presented in Bilbao. The exhibition was also accompanied by many dear and respected colleagues like Dominique Leong and many others. And well, Jan Sutella, Didier Faustino, most architects, among many others. I was forgetting some of them. And I agree when Manuel says that the idea of architecture is in a state of constant relocation. And I think that's when we find that we were looking at a similar vision of architecture. So it's almost like music when it becomes a physical register on a vinyl record, waiting to be decoded and to be played as music again. And by breaking down the layers of content, actually Split Subject was materializing a more complex history. These are some of the fragments of the first iteration for the thesis dissertation. And then finally, these were presented more recently on Museo Franz Mayer here in Mexico. But just like to finish this note and going back full circle, to me this piece really represented an opportunity to be able to draw a social legacy and that was hidden from Playview. And I have learned through all of these projects and all through these years that in fact, as French poet Stéphane Mallarmé pointed out, nothing will have taken place but the place. Thank you so much for your time today.